We left off in the last video, we had just completed our custom button and custom text field. So in this video, we're going to get to see the fruits of our labor, right? We're going to get to utilize those objects that we built. So you can see once you have all that stuff, kind of pre-built, you'll see how quickly building screens is and how clean it can be. This is also going to be the first video where we get into programmatic UI and programmatic constraints and how to lay all that out. So we're going to dive into that as well. At the end of the video, we're just going to have our search screen looking exactly like you see on the design. So let's go to our search VC. All this in here is that system pink background. We're going to get rid of that. We don't need that anymore. As you can see up here in the design, we basically want to lay out three elements, right? We have our logo at the top, we have our text field, and we have our get followers button. So the first thing we want to do is initialize those three objects. And I like to do, when I'm creating my objects, this is just a personal preference and a style thing. I like to do them in order of like appearance from top to bottom. And I try to do that with my functions too. Sometimes it doesn't always work out, but I try to keep my functions in like the order that they're going to kind of be called in. But anyway, so we're going to say let's logo image view equal, and this is going to be a UI image view, just a plain old UI image view because there's nothing custom about it. We're going to make some custom image views later in the course, but right now that's just a regular UI image view. And now here's kind of where you're going to see the magic of our custom objects here. So let's username text field equal GF text field. So there you go. So just by doing that, we get all that customization because when we call this initializer, if we go back to the text field, GF text field, this is what gets called when we just do that initializer. And if you notice in our initializer, we're calling configure. So configure gets called on our GF button, and then all this styling happens. So that's what's going on with our custom objects here. And you're going to see that even more in play here with the let's I like to call these generic names if I can. So call to action button. You could say get followers button, something like that. But what if the title changes to something different? Now your get followers button doesn't really line up with the new title of the button. That's happened to me many, many times. So that's why I try to get these generic. So call to action button is going to be our GF button. Now you can see when we do our initializer, we get the autocomplete. And since we have our custom initializer here with background color and title, that now shows up in the autocomplete, right? If we didn't write that, we would just be able to initialize it with a frame. But we're going to initialize it with the background color. That is going to be .system green, like you see in the design. And then the title we're going to pass in is get followers, just like that. So you can see, like, I don't have to, with this custom initializer, just pass in a color, pass in a title, we're good. I don't have to configure all that in my view controller. And then just like in the text field, this is what gets called. I'm setting the background color for what I passed in, setting the title for what I passed in, and then we also call configure, and it configures all this other stuff that we set up as well. So again, just in that line of code, our GF buttons are completely stylized. We just have to lay it out. And I know I like to do, again, the two vertical spaces. I just deleted the background color, but we have to do that actually. So view.background color equals .system background. What this is going to be for light mode, this is going to be white. For dark mode, it's going to be black. Again, we're implementing the dark mode as we go. So if you did background color .white, it would always be white. But now with system background, it's going to adapt. And the other thing, if you look at this design, you notice this initial page doesn't have the nav bar at the top, right? We wanted it clean. We didn't want the nav bar. That was just a design choice. You could have the nav bar if you like, but you'll see if you put it in, it kind of looks weird. So we want to hide the nav bar on just this screen. So if we did that in view did load, that would work. But we're going to do it in view will appear, and I'll tell you why here in a second. So let's write our other lifecycle method, view will appear, and make sure you call the super. Anytime you're overriding something, most of the time you're going to want to call the super, right? The only time you wouldn't want to call the super is, again, if you didn't want the parent function to be called where you get all the functionality for free. So super.view will appear, and then we're going to pass in animated that you see up here. And we're going to do navigation controller .is navigation bar hidden, that's what I thought it was, equals true. Now, the reason we're doing that in view will appear is because, as the name of the function says, like, this is what happens every time the view will appear. View did load only gets called the first time the view loads. So what happens is, if we did it in view did load, it would look fine. And then we would hit get followers, it would pull up our collection view of follower list, and then when we hit back, the navigation bar would be there because the navigation bar is there on the next screen. We're gonna code it so it is. Because view to load doesn't get called when you go back because the view has already been loaded. However, in view will appear, this gets called every time the view appears. So if I go back, back to the search screen from the follower list, this is going to get called. So I want to make sure I hide the navigation bar every time this pops up. And once I test this out later in the course, I'll be sure to point that out as well. Because basically when we go to the follower screen, we're going to have to set navigation controller.isNavBarHidden to false. Like we're going to want to show that, and you'll see that later. So to lay out this screen, I'm going to break each item down individually. You can kind of refactor this how you like. There's many different ways to do it. For educational purposes, I'm going to break each one down individually in its own function, like you'll see here. So the first thing we want to lay out, again, I like to do top to bottom. And first of all, what we got to do before we forget, line them up. So let's call this func configure logo image view, right? So when you're building your UI programmatically, this is going to, I guarantee you're going to forget to do this all the time. I still do. You'll configure everything. Nothing happens until you add that view to the sub view. So view.add sub view. We want to add logo image view, right? This is the equivalent of, if you're used to storyboard, that line of code is the equivalent of grabbing a UI image view out of the library, dragging it onto your view controller and dropping it. That's adding the sub view. So imagine you write all this configuration code and you forget this line. That's like configuring it, but forgetting to add it to your view controller in storyboard. So I do this all the time. I'll forget to add it to the sub view. It happens, but you got to do that for everyone, and you'll see that. And like I mentioned before, when you're dealing with programmatic UI and auto layout, you have to do the logo image view dot translates auto resizing mask into constraints equals false. Now you're going to notice I'm not going to have to do this line of code for my GF text field and GF button, because remember, we put that line of code in the custom object. But this is just a regular UI image view. This isn't a custom one, so that's why I have to write that line of code. And then the last one we want to do is logo, not the last thing, but the next thing, logo image view dot image equals, and we're going to initialize the UI image named. Scroll down here to the autocomplete, pass in the string, and this is gh-logo, not loho, logo. Actually, great segue. I did that by accident. We're not gonna do this right now because these aren't being reused. But this is what's called stringly typed. And this is a little dangerous because stringly typed, that's not like an official term. It's kind of like a nickname that the community has given it. But like I just did, right? I had loho right there. That typo will crash my app. This is why the strings are kind of dangerous. So oftentimes you'll see anytime with stringly type with maybe like segues, well, we're not using storyboard. You'll see with later, we're going to kind of refactor these into constants. That way I don't have to type it out every time. I'm not going to do this right now because we're not like reusing this this name. You'll see us do more with this later, but that's anytime you see something stringly typed, you should automatically kind of think to put it into a constant. So if you have to type it again, like for example, if we had to initialize 5 images of GH logo, I would have to type it out every time. But if I put it into a constant, into a variable, now I would do something like images.logo, and it would autocomplete. I don't have to retype it. The string is only typed once where I define the constant. Again, that was a little impromptu side note because I did make a typo there. But that is setting the image to the logo that we see. So now comes the fun part. Now is where we get to lay out all the constraints programmatically. So to do that, you want to do nslayout constraint.activate. You may have seen, and I've done this in previous videos, I'm constantly learning myself and improving, where I did them all individually, and then you would see like .isActive equals true. You would see that at the end of it, and that gets very repetitive. Well, the more efficient way is to do ns constraint.activate and then put an array of constraints in there, and this all activates it. This is the more efficient, better way. A rule of thumb when laying out your constraints is, again, rule of thumb doesn't mean it's 100% accurate, but almost all the time this is going to be true, is you want to have 4 constraints per object. Usually it's a height, width, and x coordinate, y coordinate. Like those are the 4 things auto layout needs to know to where to put something. So you're going to see 4 constraints on everything. If you find yourself having 7 constraints on an object, you're probably messing up. Or if you find yourself having 2, like something's missing. Sometimes on labels, you only need 3. Again, there's edge cases where you can get away with only having 3, but for the most part, you're going to need 4. So let's do, so for this image, I know it's going to be a square. As you see up here in the design, it's going to be at the top. So let's do logo image view dot top anchor, because this is what we're pinning to the top, dot constraint. So this is where we're setting the actual constraint value. And there's a whole bunch of these. These are kind of confusing. I get it. I always do, or not always, for the most part, equal to another anchor. So anchors were introduced in iOS 9. It's a much easier way to write constraints. So basically, this is what I'm pinning it to if you're familiar with doing constraints via storyboard. And then I got to give it a constant. So what I want to make this, what I want to pin it to or equal to is the view.safe area layout guide, because at the top right, you got the notch to deal with. So we want to make sure we're doing the safe area layout guide on the top. We don't necessarily have to worry about that on the sides, because remember, we're not doing landscape. You have to worry about safe area on the side and landscape, because when you rotate the phone, you know, the notch is on the left. View.safearealayoutguide.top anchor. This is super long here. And the constant we want is 80. Again, remember what I said is that like I have all these numbers dialed in. This took trial and error to try to figure it out. And then logo image view dot center X. So we're centering it in the X here, right? Dot constraint. And then now I don't need a constant, right? I just need equal to another anchor, as you see there. And then I want this to be equal to view.center X anchor. So basically what I'm saying is center this in the view. And if this is a little bit confusing, you're not quite following along, trust me, we're going to be doing constraints like this like 100 more times. So through repetition, I believe you're going to start to get it. Even if it is a little fuzzy right now, we're going to get a lot of practice at this throughout the course. Oh, by the way, we need comma since we're passing in an array. I kind of forget that sometimes. So comma, comma. So basically, this is an array of constraints that we're activating here. So again, we have our top anchor, which is where it is on the Y coordinate up and down. We know where it's at on the X coordinate, side to side, center of the view. So we're missing height and width. So logo image view dot height anchor dot constraint. And now we can just pass in a constant, right? Equal to constant, because we're just passing in a number, and it's going to be 200. And same thing for the width, because this is a square image. And I actually recommend, if you're creating your own assets, like do your best to make them square images. Those are just so much more easier to lay out and deal with, like aspect ratios and all that stuff. So logo.imageView.width anchor, same thing, dot constraint, equal to constant, 200. So we're done configuring our image view. Again, we've added the subview to the view. And the view is like the view that comes with the view controller. Every view controller has like the view in the main view. And then we're setting the auto resizing mask into constraints to false. That means we're going to use auto layout. And then we set the image to the GH logo. And again, this is going to flip back and forth between dark mode and light mode because we did that earlier with our assets. And we set all our constraints. Again, X, Y, height, width. So let's run this and see what we got on our search screen. Oh, I almost forgot. I do this all the time. We did not call the function configure logo image view. So now when we run it, we should see our logo placed nicely. And yep, there we are. Looks great, right? You see it's dead center. It's 80 points from the safe area, so the bottom of the notch, and it's 200 by 200. That looks good. How I came up with the 200 by 200 is the smallest width of the phone, the iPhone SE, the old iPhone 5 model, is 320 points. This is where it helps to know like how many points each phone is. Like the iPhone X, yes, X, or iPhone 11, they're all 375 wide. You know, the plus ones are like 414. They get a little bigger. Having a general idea of how wide each one is will kind of really help you when coming up with, you know, kind of these numbers. So I figured 200 by 200 would look good on all screen sizes. Of course, you could conditionally adjust it based on the screen size if you really wanted to get detailed. But again, back to this whole like take home project, they only expect you to work on this for 2 to 4 hours. They don't expect all this super fine detail, but you could go above and beyond if you choose to. So that was our logo image view. Now we just have 2 more items to lay out, right? We have our text field and our button. Remember I said we're gonna get a lot of practice at constraints? Well, here we go. So next up, 2 spaces here, func configure text field. And same thing, first thing we have to do, I want to drill this into your head. View.add subview username text field, right? That's the first thing you need to do. And then because we've done all our styling in the custom field, we're just right on to constraints. We don't have to mess with anything. So ns layout constraint.activate. And again, if you've done this before and you've kind of like done this differently, like I said, I'm breaking this down into each item, the image view, the text field, the button for, educational purposes. There's other ways to refactor and organize this, of course. So again, we need X, Y coordinate, height, and width. So I always like to start with the top. So username, text field, .top anchor, .constraint. Is going to equal, now we're pinning it to the bottom of the logo image view. So there's going to be logo image view dot bottom anchor, and the constant is going to be 48. We want a space of 48. Again, I've tweaked that and dialed it in. So that's where it's going to be in the Y coordinate, right? It's pinned to the bottom of the logo image view. Now we want to handle kind of the width and the X coordinate where it's going to be. We can do this by pinning it to the edges. So we're going to pin it to the leading edge and the trailing edge with a space of 50 here. So you'll see username text field dot leading anchor. Again, this is like pinning it to the left and pinning it to the right in storyboard. Leading anchor dot constraint is equal to view dot leading anchor, and the constant is going to be 50. We're gonna because we want it to be spaced in, so we want a lot of space on the edge. And then you'll see what this looks like. I'll explain it here on the design. Username text field dot trailing anchor dot constraint. Again, the constant. So when you do the trailing anchors, and sometimes on the bottom, like you have to do the negative constant. That kind of catches me off guard sometimes. Sometimes I'll forget to do the negative sign and it'll be all messed up. And I was like, oh, it's got to be a negative number. So, and then now username text field, now we need the height. Because we have the width, we have where it's at on the X coordinate, we have where it's at on the Y coordinate. Now we just need the height, and we're just going to hard code that at 50. I like my text fields to be pretty tall, nice and fatty, meaty, if you will, for the tap. Same thing with my buttons for the most part. So dot height anchor dot constraint equals 50. So if you look at the user interface guidelines, they'll recommend any button, any touch target should be at least 44 points high. So at least 44 points high. So 50 makes it a nice fat target. That's what I like. That's just personal preference. So now let's call configure text field in the view to load. Let's run it and see what we got. And there you are. See, there's the 48 points from the logo pinned to the top. You can see the 50 padding on each side. It's pinned to the edges, and then it's a height of 50. So now the layout is starting to come together. And like I said, if you feel like I think I'm not going fast, but if it feels like I'm going fast, we're going to do these constraints so much, you're going to get it by the end. The last remaining piece is the button. So again, same thing. A lot of repetition here when doing constraints via programmatically. So func configure button. I should be more specific in case there's ever another button on here. Call to action button. A good thing about programming is always trying to like future-proof your screens. Of course they may not always all change, but the longer you've been doing this, you realize that like things always change, right? Oh, can you add a button to this screen? Can you add something to this screen? Like as you're building the product, things always change. So like we did before, what's the very first thing you do? The equivalent of storyboard, you got to drag the button onto the storyboard. That's what's going on here. View.add subview call to action button. And again, remember, call to action button is what we defined up here. And look, we already know the background color is going to be green. We already know the titles get followers. So I don't have to like configure this at all. So we're right on to constraints. So again, repetition, ns layout constraint dot activate. And we're going to pass in this array of constraints here. So normally I've been pinning this stuff to the top, right? I pinned the logo to the top of the view. I pinned the text field to the bottom. In this case, I want the button to be pinned to the bottom. So we're not going to actually pin the top to anything. So we're going to do call to action button dot bottom anchor dot constraint equal to view dot, again, safe area layout guide, because again, we have the home button indicator. Top and bottom, you got to deal with safe areas in our specific app because we're not messing with landscape. The left and right, you can get away with not using the safe area layout guide. The bottom, and the constant is -50. So like I said, on the trailing in the bottom, you got to use negative numbers. So now that's where it's going to be on the Y coordinate, right? We're pinning it to the bottom of the screen with a padding of 50. And so let's do similar to what we did with the text field. We're going to pin it to the edges, except we're going to have a number there. Call to action button dot leading anchor dot constraint, not a multiplier. I mean, you could use multipliers. I just prefer constants. I mean, either one's going to be fine. View dot leading anchor, and the constant there is 50. Again, very basically, we want it to be very similar to the text field. We want it to be all lined up nice and neat. Okay, call to action button dot trailing, again, repetitive, dot constraint, and make sure. So I wish that autocomplete would always be the top one because it's the one I use the most, but hey, can't complain too much. Trailing anchor, and again, the constant, because it's trailing, -50, and then again, we have our Y coordinate, it's pinned to the bottom. We have our width and X coordinate because we're pinning it to the left and right. We just need our height now. Call to action button dot height anchor, and again, it is of a constant, equal to constant 50. So we're gonna give it a height of 50. And then the last thing we need to do is configure call to action button. And if we run it again, our layout should be complete. And there you go. As you can see, I'll put the design right up next to it. Very similar to the design. We have our logo at the top, the username text field, and get followers. And like I said, because we did all the styling in our custom GF button and our custom GF text field, our view controller is relatively small, right? There's not a lot of, we're at 68 lines of code right now, but really we're just adding the sub view and laying it out. We're going to do some other stuff on this screen in the future, but hopefully you can see the power of creating those custom objects, the custom button, the custom text field. And if this was your first time doing constraints via programmatically, again, if it's a little fuzzy, we're going to be doing this a lot, so you're going to get plenty of practice. But yeah, we now have our nice layout here. The next thing we're going to do is start configuring the keyboard a little bit for when they enter a username, and then also pass data to the next screen so we can start building that beautiful collection view that I showed with all the followers. So onward.